Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 25th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being Diversity in the Nature of Wars. The text follows. The greater and the more powerful the motives of a war, the more it affects the whole existence of a people. The more violent the excitement which precedes the war, by so much the nearer will the war approach to its abstract form, so much the more will it be directed to the destruction of the enemy. So much the nearer will the military and political ends coincide, so much the more purely military and less political the war appears to be. But the weaker the motives and the tensions, so much the less will the natural direction of the military element, that is force, be coincident with the direction which the political element indicates. So much the more must, therefore, the war become diverted from its natural direction, the political object diverge from the aim of an ideal war, and the war appear to become political. But that the reader may not form any false conceptions, we must here observe that by this natural tendency of war, we only mean the philosophical, the strictly logical, and by no means the tendency of forces actually engaged in conflict, by which would be supposed to be included all the emotions and the passions of the combatants. No doubt, in some cases this also might be excited to such a degree as to be with difficulty restrained and confined to the political road. But in most cases such a contradiction will not arise, because by the existence of such strenuous exertions a great plan in harmony therewith would be implied. If the plan is directed only upon a small object, then the impulses of feeling amongst the masses will be also so weak that these masses will require to be stimulated rather than repressed. So this is a really easy paragraph to understand. I would say von Clausewitz is reasserting certain concepts that we have already met, but just combining them now in a diverse fashion to observe at various perspectives in detail. Because von Clausewitz, as you understand, is a very smart person, but while he explains, he really takes all the necessary time, because he really wants us to make us understand all the let's say the fullest implications of our of his own theory. And this is particularly important because in this paragraph he is combining the let's say the old abstract theoretical idea of war that fundamentally tends towards the absolute and real war, which instead is modified, it's influenced by several elements. So the usual relation between politics and war, so the whole paragraph revolves fundamentally on it. But he tells us something new, as he notices, as you understand from the same title, that fundamentally wars can differ naturally, even in the relation that exists between politics and war in itself, and can lean more or less towards the absolute, right? So that every war, by the way, is different and has to be understood as such. And here he also talks about the passions, the emotions, that are definitely very important every time you want to look at the combatants, but also the reasons, in fact, that on a broader scale of the government of the state, so the people, in other words, etc. So now we let's simply read. So the diversity in the nature of wars. So here the first part is all about this reassessment of what he has said. You know, the greater and the more powerful the motives of a war, and the more it affects the whole existence of a people. This is particularly important. In other words, the more there are reasons to fight a war, and more the people of the combatant state will effectively be affected by it, and will change, and their life will change accordingly. Here, von Clausewitz stresses the whole existence of a people in many ways, in ways that are not just internal but also external. Because what effectively is able this people is able to deliver, even towards the outside, is particularly important. So it definitely changes even the relation with whoever surrounds them, and not just even those who are effectively fighting at this point, without meaning that the thing can't effectively come to, that the war can't arrive to their inside their homes fundamentally. So this can go also the other way. So in many ways, in fact, it happens also the contrary in war, that the more a war is, the more a people is, a state, let's say better, is loaded with motives and powerful motives for fighting a war, and the more these consequences are gonna can also backfire. The reaction that can be met in the outside can also bring war into their homeland and to annihilate them. Just think about World War II. That's a perfect example of how effectively the German people at that point was fairly, because of the regime, the Nazi regime and propaganda, was firmly convinced of the necessity at that point of the war, etc. It was this great national commitment, but eventually this was so intense that it kind of backfired. The Barbarossa failed. The Soviets passed on the offensive eventually, and the war was brought into the same core of Germany. And looking at the whole existence of a people in this sense is important, because effectively the existence of those populations, whether they were the Germans or the Soviets ruled, or whoever was in the middle, like in Poland, also in other areas of Europe or in the world, at this point was affected deeply, right? And their whole existence was, when you have your house bombed, destroyed, your parent, your family massacred, and you hold a gun and you stay in combat, definitely that affects your existence as a whole, and the existence of the same people. There are peoples historically that, from this perspective, risked annihilation. And effectively, that example is also the example of tens of millions of people who were literally turned into ashes in a way or another. So this statement is very meaningful. When you read von Clausewitz, as I always say, you have this beautiful opportunity of measuring what he's saying on actual history, on the basis of actual historical experience, and observe what he's talking about. So once again, he continues and says, the more violent the excitement which precedes the war, by so much the nearer will the war approach to its abstract form. So this is particularly important, because, as we have seen, the abstract form of war that von Clausewitz has, the very initial paragraphs of this chapter dedicated to, is what gradually, gets, in the logical chain that we have been following with this series, gets effectively reduced. It's not more absolute. It's not anymore absolute or absolute. It gets realized in many ways, but at the same time, this relation between theory and practice is always existing there. Every war, and every real war, doesn't just lean obviously towards the real, let's say the abstraction of the theory of war as for what war should be. So these absolute clashes of forces that get immediately spent and destroy everything. No, war is something completely different. Real wars are something like that, something very different. But von Clausewitz tells us that there is always this swing and this shift that for which it's possible that a real war definitely comes not necessarily that can grow closer definitely to the abstraction. And this happens by increasing the excitement, the violence of the excitement that precedes the war. This is particularly interesting because you realize that some of the greatest conflicts that have been fought historically were preceded, in fact, by extremely violent excitement, right? So, especially if you look at world wars, some also of the other great conflicts, there was definitely this excitement before. Just think about World War I, how every nation basically believed that this war would have proved their strength, their force, their superiority, and this was fueled by very, violent feelings and aggressive feelings, and then look at what happened effectively. Same goes for the totalitarian regimes that brought to World War II. We're so happy about, now we will conquer the world, we will annihilate our enemies, we will wipe them out from the face of the earth. And guess what happened? So something very dramatic indeed, that in this sense approaches the abstract, the absolute form of war. And just thinking about, and this here from Clausewitz is stressing the moment before, but as we've seen from the same Clausewitzian theory, the same war is characterized by moments of inaction, of suspension of the military operations, and therefore it's as if there were several combats that were, intermittently, lighten up once again, etc. And think about 1943 total war concept brought into Nazi Germany. Basically, in that time, the National Socialist regime had understood in practice that the war was lost effectively, but they wanted to keep on fighting, and they basically propagandated this idea of total war that also has this Clausewitzian ego, definitely, as something definitely, raping the sense of von Clausewitz's theory, because here that's the point. War can't be total, can't be something, it can't approach that. Definitely, it can get like a war of annihilation, a sort of this mass destruction war, like the one the Nazis wanted effectively to carry out. But that was also something that was decided, in fact, during the conflict, and also trying to re-stress, in fact, the violent excitement within the same war. So there is always this kind of of suspension into which these violent sentiments can be refueled in many ways. This happened also between a campaign and another. It was political, but as well social, as you understand, because this effectively, the world people was required now to contribute to this economy of war that up to that time actually the Germans hadn't paid very much. Just the subjugated populations of the Reich had mostly borne, because in fact Nazi Germany didn't have actually a war economy up to that point. Didn't have it up to that point. So it was asking more. So this excitement was naturally fueled with propaganda, with means of political, persuasion, if we want to put it euphemistically in these terms, and this is what was required. So that effectively led, especially on the Eastern Front, on a war that brought to mass destruction, even in actual, mostly in defense at that point from the German side. However, what we were saying here, so the more the violent excitement which preceded the war, we've said, by so much the nearer will the war approach to its abstract form, then so much the more will it be directed to the destruction of the enemy, right? So there is this element of pure force, of pure violence. Remember always that in the Clausewitzian doctrine, war is an act of violence. That's the definition of it. The violence cannot be separated from war, from the most intimate, the truest, and the most totalizing a meaning of war. War is pure violence in itself, and whatever it is not is basically this modification and control that comes from other parts of politics chiefly, but also from the environment, the human nature, etc., that kind of mitigates this. But the theory is and that the more you want effectively to fight, and the more your reaction is violent, the more your action is violent. Actually, sorry, and this naturally brings also in terms of the reaction proper a greater resistance, because at least in relative terms, because definitely if you go there with against someone that and that someone knows that effectively you are loaded with all this extreme violent impulse, that person will hopefully react accordingly, at least for self-defense, for self-defense. So but the point von Clausewitz is making here is that the more powerful these motives of a war are, and the more what you really want to achieve is the destruction of the enemy. Really, the physical destruction, not just the making the enemy fulfilling your will. It's really going there with very, very heavy means to basically smash this down, your opponent down, and to impose your motives, in fact, with violence. And this is kind of obvious. Just think about when you're, I don't know, loaded in anger. You feel these aggressive feelings. You may want to smash someone's face because they cut the crossroad, the path in front of you, and the risk an accident. You really go mad because of that. All you want to do is to effectively smash that person's face, bit the hell out of them, and that's really the point. That's because you have a powerful motive, and that's what you want is effectively the destruction of your opponent. This is what von Clausewitz is telling you, and this happens both at the individual level, like on that occasion, and at the level of states, fighting states, of combatant states. This is important to understand because a way to relate to to understand from the Clausewitzian thought is effectively relating these dynamics to the ones of your own life, because in more or less important dimension, let's say, in more or less important measure, we all experience these problems. So we can definitely understand it, even if we hopefully don't want to smash anybody's face, most of the times at least. We definitely can understand how the power of motives is something that pushes us to do a lot and to putting force and strength into it, whichever it is. And this goes beyond conflict. This is another very important Clausewitzian theory that can be applied to psychology, to any kind of social behavior. I mean, in order to get things done, you must have a certain amount of aggressiveness. You can't basically do anything if you don't say, oh, what the hell, now I must do that, and loading yourself with this kind of anger and violence and saying, at least now I motivate myself, I load myself, I charge myself. This is a way how this is the way human mind works, and there wouldn't be any action if we hadn't such even capacity of physical action that naturally can be channeled in productive things, productive activities and achievements, but is still fueled in part by this fundamental violence that we all own, and that that influences our behavior and makes it more or less functional to this world. As a matter of fact, psychiatric studies actually show us that people who tend to get angry and are impulsive and contrarily wise to common say, are actually some of the most confident people that exist. So this is particularly important because they are people who, as a matter of fact, know how to feel confident enough to support their point of view, to defend themselves, to be able to that are able to act and not to be intimidated. And in war, it really functions like this. What you want is something that you want to achieve, and you give a cost to it. And according to this cost, you realize that the only way to spend this effectively and to make a good investment is to commit yourself to it. And you can't have this without an aggressive capacity. That's why in even in management, in certain even in career, etc., there is this idea that a healthy dose of aggressiveness is necessary, right, for making things work well. So here again it says the more this violent excitement pushes us. No, actually no. We had finished the list. No, actually not. The list wasn't finished. So the more the violent excitement which precedes the war, so much the nearer will the military and political ends coincide. This is once again the another statement that von Clausewitz has already made previously, and that is reinforced in here because it shows us that basically the more powerful our motives are, the more these motives translate themselves into actually military action. Or better, perhaps this is not the correct explanation, but let's say the more our objectives pass through the military action. So and the military and political ends coincide, right? So the more, in other words, the more you're determined, the more powerful your motives are, and the more you're willing to risk. This is something that von Clausewitz doesn't say in here, but is entailed in the previous paragraphs that we have read. Because the more you're confident, the more you about this choice specifically, and the more you're willing even to risk, because you say, this thing has to be done. So the only way to do it is effectively risking, because the military action entails risks, but in this sense, in war, this risk has to be necessarily taken. So the political goal is in many ways more able to transfer itself into the military action. Also because war, as this very brutal and demanding effort, is something that you really need a reason to endure in some measure, and to embark yourself on. So this is why it's kind of easier. You can't just make an example. You could spend, a state, wants to conquer the region of another state, and there are many options. So as we have beautifully remembered in the previous paragraph, war is just an instrument of policy, nothing else. So it's an option you have. It's not that there is just war as an option at all times. Even when this is the most convenient choice, indeed, you still can do something else. And still, by using war, you can intervene more or less into your with violence, fundamentally. the more you're convinced about your action, the necessity of your action, and the more you're confident to screw up diplomacy fundamentally and just to go there and take what you want with violence, because that is something that gets the thing done kind of more brutally, right? So it's not necessarily the best choice, of course, but it's a more impacting one. But in order to do it, that you need to be motivated. You need to justify that instead than staying there and wait what happens, trying with diplomacy, with political negotiation. And this normally happens where there is no commitment to war in itself. If a population wants war altogether, and what you can see is effectively just, it only requires for you to use that violence, that rage, those aggressive passions and emotions, well, why not channeling them immediately into the military action that can at least have this more direct approach to what you want to really achieve in strategic terms. This is what von Clausewitz is telling us. So at that point, there is definitely a convergence, a meeting point. I mean, not necessarily, but definitely a tendential convergence of the political and the military end. Because what you want to achieve fundamentally is closer to what the military action can take you. Otherwise, von Clausewitz has explained us that human behavior, tendentially, human mind tends to stay away from violence in itself. It tends to solve problems rationally, to kind of prearrange things to avoid problems actually. But when the thing becomes for these powerful motives unavoidable, you want to tend to do it because you're motivated enough. That's fundamentally the discriminant of the whole thing, that you're motivated to do it. It's not that you're just calculating it. You're basically supporting that with your emotions, with your passions. There are something that at that point in fact do not have a real as themselves a rational reason. I mean, your motives definitely can be rational, but at the same time they can be supported by this feeling of hostility that, by the way, now this opens too many parentheses, but here the two things always coexist. Like, there is always a rational direction that is effectively closer to the political one, and a passional, emotional one that unleashes itself chiefly into direct violence. Right? So, in other words, passions and emotions can make you lose the ability to solve things in a more complex way, and just to have this outbreak of violence to hopefully settle the matter. So, but all of this varies, because both things exist at the same time, and even as themselves are, albeit intertwined, still on two different levels, which means that still, even in front of very strong strongly violent feelings, the rational element can control them, right? So they do not act on the same level. They interfere with each other, but they can kind of reason. Each one, they can better, behave each one according to their own logic, right? And this is effectively what even things like discipline serve to. I mean, discipline is chiefly aimed at not losing your mind in situations in which instead your mind would follow more instinctual directions that are most of the times passional, emotional. So discipline in other ways teaches you how to be cold, or to remain cold for a longer time, and to rely on your nerves as long as possible, and therefore to keep doing what your reason, let's say, tells you to do, hoping that this reason is guiding you correctly. This is an example I made at an individual level, but on a larger scale, this happens because theoretically, the soldier that fights in the front line is the one who requires necessarily more emotions and passions, because objectively, when you have to make a charge at the bayonet in front of an MG nest, you really and because you have no other option, let's assume that, just for like I was thinking about a World War First setting, you don't need much reason. What you need is courage. What you need is guts. So you received your training, but you can't do anything with your training if effectively you don't overcome fear, and you get out there, even knowing that very likely you're gonna be gunned down. Very different at that point is what you require. The general headquarters, where you have to require entire divisions to move on a certain objective, because at that point that's something you're calculating, let's say relatively coldly, in a place where hopefully there's not much of action, where you're effectively trying to calculate, to sort things out on the base of data. It's mostly an intellectual work that requires reason more than feelings. As a matter of fact, feelings and emotions on that table should ideally not exist. Then, unfortunately, also many military mistakes at the higher levels are caused by presence of passion and emotion when dealing with this problem. So, but ideally, that's how it goes, and that's also why a good government makes this choice. Definitely fueled also all these in the Clausewitzian Trinity. All these elements fundamentally are intertwined. I mean, there is a component of reason and emotion in both. In all of three the elements, in the military, in the government, and in the people, and they all interfere with each other, because the government is not detached from the passions of the people. The reason, let's say, has to belong to the military commander as much as to the political leader. There is this idea of daring, of betting, of throwing the dice that is proper also, especially of the military, but has to do also with naturally what society thinks about that the conflict, what also in part the government is thinking. So all these elements are part of the same entity that is naturally extremely complex, is part of different it's actually a sum of different elements that also have many intersections with what happens outside of this ensemble. So it's all extremely complicated, but there are these tensions, these directions that are by default, let's say, existing into the dynamic, and that aside from the contingental situation, always follow the same trend, right? And von Clausewitz is telling us that this is in fact the difference between theory and practice. It's not that theory is one thing and practice is wholly another, and vice versa. I mean, the reality has always needs theory and reason, but as much as also as practice and emotions and passions, what you really feel. There is that beautiful paragraph of von Clausewitz that we have read, that is the 22nd, that is perhaps one of the most poetic of von Clausewitz, that tells, but should theory just be self-satisfied just with absolute conclusions and rules? But no, of course, theory if it was, say, it would be of no practical use. It has to take into consideration the fact that as humans we're not fully rational. Actually, most of the times we are not rational. In fact, as if we make a just a quantitative statistic, that's the point. And therefore, when we talk about reality, you can't take out these elements from the calculation of the wall. So whatever this the closer, let's say, to the abstract reality is, but still it has part of, it still works on the basis of theory and of practice combined. So going on, von Clausewitz says then on the trail of the last proposition he had made, so the more violent the motives, the excitement are, the more powerful the motives are in the war, and so much the more purely military and less political the war appears to be. So this is also interesting because it takes into consideration what we feel it like, right? From our perspective, we have seen that real wars are always more political things than the strictly military things. War, as a matter of fact, is a political act, right? As von Clausewitz defined it. So here, and this is why von Clausewitz is also genial. He throws in, and you have to be cautious. You have to be to watch look at detail, even of his words, of his speech. He's telling us that sometimes we look at things the way they, not the way they really are, but what they seem to be to us. So it may as well seem, and tendentially, I don't think von Clausewitz has ever said it up to this point, but from here the phrase is relatively clear about this. He says, the purely military and less political the war appears to be. It doesn't say so much, so less the purely political and the more the military the war appears to be. It says the contrary. The more purely military and the less political. So appears. Not is, because if he had to, if he were to write it is, not it appears, he would have definitely written the more purely political and more military the war appears to be, right? Because that would have been a rational statement. Here, it's about appearance. So what our subjective idea of war is being built like culturally and tendentially and instinctively, because this also goes beyond culture, this goes beyond history. It's about the fact that as humans, the things like fight and combat, etc., are always something that somewhat polarize our mind. They almost immediately get at the center of attention for many reasons, because they stimulate passions and emotions in us, and also because they are chaotic, and human mind is attracted by chaos. A human mind is not satisfied, even when when you're rich enough, etc. It seems that what human mind is all about is about solving problems and going search for problems if these are not present at the moment. This is extraordinary. So it's obvious that war, as basically the most chaotic and unpredictable thing in terms of human activities, as von Clausewitz puts it, is definitely what attracts us so much to even picture it, to make it appear to ourselves as a sort of a amazingly theatrical event that you have to be polarized on from a strictly military point of view. Very few people care about the political side of war, and this is normal. This is normal. This happens at an instinctual level. It's like discipline. It's like reason. It's counterintuitive. because our intuition is fundamentally based on instinct in many ways, on something that we don't really think out rationally. And this thing here is beautifully written, okay? Because here it says that the more the stronger the motives are, and the more it seems as if war was all about itself from a strictly military point of view, right? It's I don't know if you really got the point, but also in here it's useful to make examples about this, because what is that people are attracted by when, I don't know, they watch just to make it simple, World War II documentary? Is it about, just look at how even documentaries are made, because they are chiefly, commercial products, right? What you see is, a little bit of history. Like, all it takes, even told in a kind of narrative tone, like in a synthetic way, of course, or it's in a concise way with just essentials and covering just what more or less people remind in the back of their minds, about what they have studied at school about it, but it's not important. What they really load documentaries with is pictures of tanks, of explosions, of bombardments, of soldiers shooting, of machine guns, of planes bombing and gunning each other down. That's what really we are attracted by. That's the spectacular side of war that absorbs our attention, and that instinctively also leads us to conceive war from an emotional perspective, which is by far how war is considered in our human perspective. I can't say a popular perspective, a cultural perspective, a civilization perspective. It's really about how we instinctively feel about that. I mean, even if one day we were to all learn von Clausewitz mandatorily and study all this, we would be attracted by those things. And this is particularly evident. I'm confident that I mean, I don't want to flatter myself that much, but I'm confident, at least among you, that there are some fine people who have a pretty solid understanding of the history, of military history. I mean, it doesn't require really to be an expert, etc., but really having a realistic picture of how those things are, and you can perfectly relate to this. We all love these topics, and great part of why we love them is it's not rational. It's really about what the feeling of this reflections of this knowledge of this, these images gives us. And then from then we're naturally able to build on it from a rational point of view, so that we naturally can expand our knowledge, can understand better things in a colder way, etc. But it all starts with you, being obsessed as a kid by war movies or something like that, because it's normal. We're meant to do that, and that's why such things are entertaining. That's why the war, even culturally speaking, in all its ugliness and its terrible aspects and most horrible and unspeakable aspects, is so fascinating. Why we actually love war. We have this sense of lust for war in a certain sense, because we perfectly know at a rational level that war is awful, and none of us would effectively like to have been there, if not maybe just for a strictly historical interest. But the point is, we like these things because they awake something within ourselves that are basically written in our genes, in the conflictual nature of our essence, of our nature, of evolution, and etc. So I believe it's particularly important to stress, also to understand why von Clausewitz is giving us, even in his speech, in his rhetoric, this kind of poetic patterns of interpretation and word choices, and this is not to be not a secondary element in von Clausewitz's narrative, right? It's particularly important, and it has to be understood and tasted while you read him, while you study him. So where were we? The weaker the motives and intentions, so much. Yeah, okay, so the more, okay. So then he goes on, it says, but the weaker the motives and attentions, so here it's reversing it, so much the less will the natural direction of the military element, that is force, be coincident with the direction which the political element indicates. So this is particularly important because it basically tells you that there is a relation between how wars are fought and the way, from a strictly military point of view, and the way the political, let's say, the motives behind that are. This is self-evident. It's like, there are many examples in history of populations of peoples that were effectively not motivated to go to war. They were pushed to do it because they were either forced, or this was, either the only possible way. And effectively, the way that this war was fought resented of this, because there was no true commitment into the military action. And in other words, it's as if politics at this point was devoid of these feelings that made it possible instead to, in the previous examples, in the opposite way, to give strength to the military action just through its choice. That's also why politics has to deal, obviously, with the feelings of the people. This is what von Clausewitz very importantly introduced in Western thought, is that you can't, and this naturally had been, in historical perspective, the lesson that the Napoleonic Wars had taught. The Napoleonic Wars had effectively showed that a people's army, like the French Revolutionary one, basically could do when it was motivated, when it was basically unchained and unrestrained from the old ancien regime hierarchies and impositions, and could fight for as a whole people, as a whole movement. And this army had effectively come to conquer almost all of Europe. And also in the progressive liberation of Europe from the French domination, and this was very clear for von Clausewitz as from his Prussian perspective. Definitely the warlike the warlike feelings of peoples had played a very important role. Right, so wars like the one of the brought from 1813 to 1815 to this progressive collapse of the empire was effectively guided by the rebellion of the populations that had been subjected to the French rule and had previously lost. And this was a very important problem in the same organization of the armed forces of these countries, because just in von Clausewitz's example, well, at the time of the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, the French, the Prussians had an army that basically, was stagnating. It didn't have any real. It was an old model army, still guided by the old principles, with the old hierarchies, etc., and had not had that spirit that had been it had grown anachronistic, right? And the Prussians were the ones that up to a few decades before actually were considered the strongest army in Europe with Frederick the Great, etc. But now the society had changed. This is why society has always to be taken into consideration. And the new model represented by the French revolutionary force now effectively annihilated. It wasn't the revolutionary proper, but still, the French imperial army from the emerging from the French Revolution, politically, ideologically, etc., destroyed, annihilated the Prussian armed forces at that point. So what effectively happened afterwards is that where von Clausewitz worked so much in the chief of staff, etc., to reform the Prussian army on different models that at that point could adapt the Ancien regime forces to actually mass society, to this increasing national character of armed forces, and therefore also make it more flexible, more adaptable, more competitive for that specific context. And this went far beyond, because von Clausewitz's ideas didn't just grow anachronistic in this sense. He wrote something that was effectively used even after his death for unifying Germany, in going basically far beyond all the other theoretical, say, theory of war that had been presented either to, and that managed this actually pretty modest armored force of Prussia at the beginning of the 18th century to become in a few decades after the fall of the Napoleonic Wars, the Prussian army, it was kind of good just after that, but in a few decades it kind of became weak again. It's effectively because of von Moltke, of the reform of the armed forces on the Clausewitzian basis that Prussia became what it became. It managed to defeat the most efficient army of the time. It was the French one, and to unify Germany and to bring this beyond, actually, in terms of theoretical, of the theory of war, as von Clausewitz became the text of all the world's militaries to eventually in the 20th century to organize their armed forces philosophically before then. Actually, Clausewitz doesn't tell you how to organize troops in the to organize armies in the 20th century. It just tells you, how you should see war like. So I don't even remember why I got here, but this is important to remember. Because I was basically telling you that in the 18th century there had been this increasing detachment between the army's commitment, the army's commitments and the political cause of the absolute monarchies and their functionment, not just in the relation between politics and war, but also with the people, etc. So all the problems that brought to the Ancien regime to effectively crumble in the space length of 2 centuries, not even. So it's not even that, actually 1 century or something more. So it's particularly meaningful to consider that it's not all about what kind of troops you have from a strictly military point of view. I mean, what from a strict physical point of view, what you have on paper in terms of guns, of cannons, etc. But what you have as a spirit of an armored force, that is also the spirit of a people, right? And with a government that has to be able to direct the popular to channel the popular feelings also into the military action that can, in this sense, be more useful to politics as long as it is committed to this role, and therefore converges progressively in its ends to towards the ends of politics, right? So the political ends. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, so much the more must therefore the war become diverted from its natural direction, the political object diverge from the aim of an ideal war, and the war appear to become political. So here, once again, the concept of appearance, like it seems, why do you do that? You know, why is that certain military actions are taken and seem to be kind of just maybe provocations in the international arena? You know, we've seen it kind of recently in the end of the Syrian conflict, where definitely many actions that were played at that point not to sensibly defeat the enemy, but just to show, I don't know, that there was someone there was still someone's presence in there that wanted to participate to the international game, that wanted to have his say in the matter, that could still prove to be effective in some way, and that's normal. You know, many military operations are effectively very close to purely military purely political calculations. And also in here, what von Clausewitz doesn't expressly says, but is contained in his theory, is that actually the majority of I mean, it's a relative term, of course, but it's in fact a matter of tendency, that the majority of military operations are actually very close to political actions, you know, as political acts proper. So this is not to be forgotten, because it reconfirms very realistically the character of political instrument of war, right? Most military actions are effectively in which we are tricked in here, because von Clausewitz says, you know, the more they appear to become political, I mean, the military operations, actually war in itself, the more seems to become political, the more let's say the less this motives are powerful, the less powerful these motives are. But it would have been more realistic to say that, you know, actually all military operations are political acts in themselves, so that in their nature they are unavoidably intertwined and actually dominated and controlled by the political action. But individually speaking, they, if we observe them, they seem just to become more, you know, they seem to just to start to appear to become political, while as a matter of fact every war is a political act. So it's the reverse of what we were telling you before. We instinctually don't accept that war. Instinctively, we tend not to accept that war is a political act. We prefer to see it as, now we go there, we confrontate with that enemy and we'll see who is stronger. This is the purely instinctual dimension. It's the tribal, it's the hunter-gatherer that is still to fight for survival and for the control of resources with other human groups, that thinks about this in very simplistic terms, while our world is dominated by a completely different connection that, by the way, existed also at that time. It's particularly fascinating to study even prehistoric warfare, to actually ask ourselves, what is that war is actually born? I may have to make a video about this, because it has extremely deep philosophical implications, even before than the strictly philosophical ones, and strictly historical ones. Sorry. So, but aside this, the concept is very clear. Here, von Clausewitz hasn't said anything new whatsoever that we didn't know up to this point. But he's making us reflect on at this point, on two things: on how the motives are the real and probably the most important factor in the whole equation most of the times, and how we instinctively tend not to see the story about this. We need to think that wars are things that are fought between clubs of people, of teams that we can, support because we like them for some reason, and that we have to prove, that guy is the stronger. Yeah, we don't think that there is a situation in which effectively saying who's the strongest is a question that has absolutely no meaning in actual war, as a determining factor, as a decisive factor. Let's say it's very difficult for us to see that from a fully rational perspective, and that's why there is a paradox in the process, because it's as if our social behavior was, even without acknowledging it, kind of more rational in its outcomes than what our individual perspective on war actually is. Because von Clausewitz is telling us that this is how wars are fought, that are in many ways way more rational, much more economically driven in the strictly etymological sense of the word than actually emotionally or passionately driven. They're not driven passionately or emotionally, they're simply pushed passionately and emotionally. But they're still guided in a kind of a rational way. So rational, in fact, is that the majority of wars are something that are very, very far from the abstract, the absolute of what war should be. That would be basically a war of constant annihilation with no quarter whatsoever. So this is particularly important, and this is also partly the answer to the question of when we can talk about war as such. Historically speaking, it's as if war effectively emerged with civilization in itself, because a bunch of apes smashing each other's head with a club is not war. Many animals fight against each other, but still they don't do what humans do, and especially they don't picture the conflict as in itself as something you have to work out progressively. The idea of being able of making abstractions and reasoning from a theoretical point of view that effectively makes you not behaving like a beast anymore, with all the respect I have towards beasts that I love, actually, but to behave like a truly reasonable being, to develop that intellectual skill that is able to direct effectively for how wars are fought politically, socially, and militarily at the same time, in a way that is way more rational at the end of the day than what you may think. And this is a paradox that I should investigate better. I'm not even sure whether this is actually a fair interpretation, but there's also the concept of hierarchy in here that comes into play, because one thing is considering the world, the human world, let's say, in itself, but in saying, okay, well, the world effectively is crazy. It goes on its own. Nobody knows what's going on anymore, because the world's become too complex. Yes, it is true, but at the same time, humans have this ability to form new hierarchies to deal effectively with who has to be in charge of this and to make it, and which doesn't mean absolutely that these hierarchies are always effective. They have always the right answer, but still they're tendentially more effective than what individuals would the average individual put in charge of that situation would be, at least as also in here, the leaders can be more or less skilled or talented or capable, but the hierarchy is structured, and it's structured through other people. So it's extremely fascinating to analyze as a perspective, in my opinion. Then he says, but that the reader may not form any false conception, we must here observe by this natural tendency of war, we only mean the philosophical, the strictly logical, and by no means the tendency of forces actually engaged in conflict, by which would be supposed to be included all the emotions and passions of the combatants. So here von Clausewitz is telling us, but be aware that what we have just defined is, however, not how normally things happen, because this convergence between the political and the military ends doesn't effectively happen most of the times. Actually, these forces, these motives, these passions, these emotions are very often pretty low. I mean, the majority of conflicts in reality really do not work in the fashion we have now used still as kind of an absolute dynamic to make us understand what goes on. So then he says, no doubt in some cases that these passions and emotions also might be excited to such a degree as to be with difficulty restrained and confined to the political road. But in most cases, such a contradiction will not arise, because by the existence of such strenuous exertions, a great plan in harmony therewith would be implied. So what does this mean? It means basically that plans are generally not so dramatic. We are not effectively fighting wars to literally annihilate each other. Even if people like to, sure, pacifists believe such things, like the idea that the humans are intrinsically just evil and bloodthirsty and warmongers and stuff like that, and the world will effectively reach its own destruction. I mean, it's perfectly possible that we will destroy each other. We want pretty close to it, but that's not that's mostly a matter of means employed, not really of political interests to fight such enormous fights of wars of annihilation. We went pretty close to that. Definitely in the 20th century, as is pretty clear, but there were also certain conditions at the time that brought such things to happen. And these were chiefly political conditions, social conditions. So definitely the military instrument was powerful enough to achieve certain things, but in a certain sense, it's this kind of instinctual dimension for which we really want to annihilate, to kill, to destroy, that is present, because it's this primordial violence that also makes effectively what war is about from a strictly anthropological point of view. But it's never, here von Clausewitz is saying, very rarely, or at least with great difficulty, is not to be restrained and confined to the political road. In other words, it's extremely difficult that real wars escalate into pure violence for the sake of it. There is always a war in itself. Just remember, it is always controlled and modified by exterior elements, chiefly by politics, but also by other reasons that even if we wanted to take politics out of the action, you still have, there's a paragraph that von Clausewitz dedicates to this, to the physical limits of human beings. I mean, you want to kill someone, yeah, okay, but let's say, first of all, what for? Because the motive here is everything, as we have just seen. So you have to have a pretty big reason to literally annihilate everyone. And which reason would this be? I mean, we're not genetically programmed to be wanting to annihilate everyone. This is why this kind of apocalyptical predictions about the human nature and future, that that everybody went crazy with from thinking that humans would I don't know, by the year 2000s would have already destroyed everything, and they would have annihilated each other. We're still here, actually more prospered than the time, and guess what? Nothing happened. Even wars have kind of for certain historical reasons that are contingential naturally, but they grew less destructive. At least not in potential, but in fact in the actual practice. Why? Because there is a political guidance that doesn't want that. So who is that wants to annihilate each other, really? Where's the convenience of this? How is it really possible? But there is also a great hysteria about this, and fueled chiefly by the news that are alarmistic and want to make effect and shock, so that we believe that literally there will be something like a nuclear war between, I don't know, you remember when, aside from North Korea, but you remember when the United States now launched some Tomahawk missiles into Syria, that everything, what a terrible thing, now World War III will explode between United States and Russia. Are you serious? I mean, are there? It's plenty of people, of actual adult people, who believed that. And this is disturbing, and that tells you effectively how close, paradoxically, in Clausewitzian terms, such people are close to the primitive model, and how, ironically enough, this would be actually the ones who would exercise more primitively and more violently their feelings, because they don't have restraints, because they're ignorant enough not to have stimulated their brain and to have grown some intellectual skill or awareness or rationality about assessing something like that. So this is particularly worrying, because effectively today many people reason like that, and it's always been so in a certain measure, but at least people before were kind of more pragmatically oriented, so most of them didn't even think about that. Today we leave too much space to the theoretical, and we tend to forget the practical. And von Clausewitz wrote in a time in which he definitely was a great, capable of great, theoretical abstractions for the sake of, just because he was a very highly educated person. But he also had seen effectively what war is. And he didn't believe that such things. He was into the heat of action. He saw people die. He risked his life. He was into the what hitherto had been the greatest conflict in human history, the Napoleonic Wars. And he comes up, in fact, with this statement that is fundamentally that most wars are actually not fought for the sake of annihilation and destruction, and there is not this unleashment of pure violence and nothing else. And this is a person who actually fought in those wars, who also had some emotional trails and definitely consequences of having fought into them. And the general attitude of the modern mind is, instead of the average mind today, let's say, is to say, okay, it's all about, look at how humans are evil, that they fight wars. You have effectively not understood much about the whole story, and this doesn't absolutely mean to eliminate the primordial and instinctual part of war, which is definitely what also von Clausewitz defines as fundamental of the conflict, etc. But still, doesn't tell the full story, right? So actually, when here von Clausewitz is saying that in most cases, such a contradiction like that, fundamentally, the passions and emotions of the combatants are get out of control of the political direction. He's actually, I believe, like in most cases, in other times he's making a way more absolute statement. I mean, he doesn't literally say that this has nothing to do with the actual consequences of war, because it's as if, we actually risked during Cold War that someone would have basically freaked out and pushed the button, right, and send us all into ashes. But first of all, this didn't happen, which is still a pretty important historical experience into this, an important point to consider as well. It can't be omitted from the calculation. Secondly, at that point, the annihilation would have occurred because of the choice of one person. I mean, what von Clausewitz is telling us effectively is that there can be a very destructive means in the hands of people, but still what their behavior on average, which doesn't mean that there's not a crazy guy that does the wrong thing, but still the behavior is influenced in a way that basically, as long as the human mind works even normally, even instinctively, it doesn't lead to this full passional and emotional reaction. It's always limited. And this hasn't to do with the consequences. It's like, let's say the crazy guy who goes out there and starts shooting people for no reason. It's full of mass shooters, as you can perfectly understand from the criminal accounts we're talking about. But that's because most of the time these people were literally insane. Even when they were actually driven by by some motive that definitely had brought them to behave like that. But the whole masses and generally states, and therefore certain governments that are made up by multiple, collegial institutions where people participated, there is a dialogue, do not tend to this extreme. And that's why it's interesting in an evolutionary perspective, as we were saying before, that we developed socially and as deputating kind of the rational element to the top, right? We decided that our hierarchies work because effectively what goes at the top knows what he has to do, and we have recognized that that person is the right one because of the intrinsic abilities and qualities and merit and effectiveness in solving the problem. This is the real point. That's what humans really want. That there is someone competent at the top that is often moderated. Also, our democracies effectively work like this. Fortunately, we do not live in direct democracies where the vote of the majority is absolute low. Politics is functions in this way, for which there is a bargaining. There are people who sit at a table and they decide, they contract, right? So that many times actually our governments do not do what they're sent to do. Also, fortunately, if you want, because the average individual is definitely not so competent to know what's best for the world direction. That's why we have complicated institutions and political structures that are balanced fundamentally in order to take moderate decisions and not to get to do something crazy like and to mitigate therefore any possible instinctual outcome, let's say, that can derive from just an outburst of feelings and passions. So here von Clausewitz concludes with this phrase. It says, if the plan is directed only upon a small object, then the impulses of feeling amongst the masses will be also so weak that these masses will require to be stimulated rather than repressed. So here is implicitly saying that most military operations are actually not something absolute. We already knew that from the previous paragraphs, but in here he's telling us something additional. That is that most of the times you have actually to stimulate and to orientate to push the people to back a certain military resolution, because most of the times the individual choices are relatively the overall reaction to this is the single military operations are relatively small, and there is something beyond to this, because just think about how states carry out, do you know about what your state is actually doing right now in terms of military activity? Yes, of course. Some of for those who act under the sunlight, we know that we are engaged here and there. But do you actually know? Are you actually in charge democratically of what that soldier there has to do or doesn't have to do? Of course, this is deputed to someone else. It's actually chiefly something that where the military environment has a space on its own, a dimension of its own, so that it's effectively military men that most of the time decide. But the political, decide at a small level, but still the big thing is politically mandated, and it's effectively our politicians that decide how this operation has to be taken. So most of the times we have surpassed even the bothering of saying, how do we employ the military? Simply by carrying out smaller operations. Say, okay, let's do a bit of this, and why? Because it's simply more economical, because it's way easier to carry out this, this graduated, this gradual and progressive set of operations than making this the extremely machinose and exhausting and problematic effort to commit a world mass to annihilate an entire enemy because it's gonna wipe out. We don't behave like that. It's not that effectively much changed historically in the way states are in relation with each other. It's not that we we are less or more warlike than we were in the past. We are simply capable of exploiting several different paths, let's say, into that are mainly political and not actually military, in order to reach our goals. And this doesn't mean that the conflicts are less intense, or that we hate less each other, but it's in many ways depending now on what our world works like. It's dictated on base of that. It's less convenient at this point to use violence, and that's why we live in a Pacific world that, by the way, has pacified itself also on the base of its military means, that is nuclear weapons, because we know that if we were to use more, let's say, higher means of higher and higher, more intense, stronger, more powerful use of force, we would unavoidably meet such a resistance that is not it's not worth the fight. And that's why we don't need even to convince the people to commit themselves into war. But this doesn't mean that it can't be reversed. At the variation of political interests, let's say, and let's say of settings. Okay, I'm effectively going too far right now, but this could work once again, right? It could. Our conflictuality is not erased. The conditions in which we move can definitely be, let's say, the main factor now. What happens is so less violent than before, but it's only because this appeases us in the way we are, and we haven't changed. These wars are effectively the same way our violence, our instincts are effectively the same as the one of 2,000 years ago, for instance. Whatever, I stop it here also because I'm getting distracted, and the videos are getting long. But so you realize how full of implication von Clausewitz is. There is a lot to tell, a lot to think, a lot to reflect on, and this can help us. As a matter of fact, it must help us in some measure. So that's why it's so important, and why it should be kept like this in mind as one of the most important theories we can read ever. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.